Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the battles of Lexington and Concord by Epic History. Now this is part 2 in their series on the American Revolution. So last time we saw the continued escalation as we built towards the Revolution, ending with the Boston Tea Party, which was of course a particularly inflammatory action taken by the Sons of Liberty. Today we'll see as that build continues and violence eventually erupts. Now, before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Whatever may be the consequence, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over. From Lord North. Alrighty.
April 1774. 11 years have passed since British victory in the 7 Years' War. And since that moment, ties between the 13 colonies and the motherland have been under increasing strain. Much of the dispute is over the British Parliament's right to tax the colonies.
Right, we mentioned last time that the 7 Years' War was really the inciting event for all of this, right? Ending in 1763, it's now been about a little more than 10 years after the end of that conflict, right? The 7 Years' War meant far more direct influence from the British government, right? A bunch of troops being sent in, a lot more direct governance, and of course, they spent so much on the war, it also meant all these additional taxes on the colonies. Now, we talked a lot about this last time. Of course, there's the economic issue, but really, the bigger issue here is more one of principle, that these colonies had been left to essentially govern themselves under the quote-unquote policy of salutary neglect, which basically meant that the British government wasn't really enforcing its policies on the colonies. Well, now, the government's arrived. Parliament is here, and it's brought troops, and it's saying, hey, not only are we putting these new taxes on you, but you're actually going to obey them. You're going to obey our policies. You're going to pay these taxes, and we are going to govern you much more directly. This was a pretty nasty shock to the colonies, who were not used to this sort of thing. And now it has been more than 10 years of that continued escalation as tension has continued to ramp up, and now violence has started to emerge. The Boston Massacre, of course, destruction of property like the Boston Tea Party, and soon we're going to get to actual battles in the field.
A right fiercely contested by many colonists. But it is also a conflict over sovereignty.
Yep.
About who governs in North America.
That's exactly it. Like I said, these colonies had essentially been governing themselves through these assemblies. They'd, in many ways, had self-government. Now, of course, they were still colonies of Britain. You know, Parliament had the ultimate say, but really, in practice, these assemblies had been governing themselves. Well, now that's changed, right? Now Parliament's here. Some soldiers are here, they want to directly govern, and so there's that, right, where these assemblies are pretty upset, these colonists are pretty upset that they can no longer govern themselves, but also they're saying, hey, you're bringing in all these policies and all these taxes, we're not even represented in the Parliament. This is the whole no taxation without representation thing, right? And so there's a lot of dissatisfaction here.
On the frontier, and for all colonists who have a stake in westward expansion, there are added reasons to resent the British government.
Oh yeah.
This is where the 7 Years' War, known locally as the French and Indian War, had started. The first shots were fired in 1754 in Ohio country by troops under the command of a 22-year-old Lieutenant Colonel George Washington.
Yep. Yeah, the 7 Years' War begins because Britain and France are fighting over Ohio. It's sort of crazy to say today, but that is really what the entire conflict erupts out of. Now, of course, you know, everything gets a whole lot more complicated after that, and you get what is really a global conflict, but it all starts here.
After the war, the British hoped to end clashes with Native American tribes and bring peace to the frontier. To this end, in 1763, a royal proclamation is issued, which imposes limits on further westward expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains into the land now termed Indian Territory.
Right, and so this is called the Proclamation Line of 1763 for pretty obvious reasons. Now, the problem here is that you've got a clash of interests. The people on the ground have different interests than the British government, right? So think about it. The British government, the king, the parliament, back in Britain, well, they've just been through this years-long conflict. It has, in many ways, bankrupted them. They've taken on all these loans. They can't afford more fighting. They don't want to deal with it. And so they say, look, we're going to set up this proclamation line. You cannot settle, and this is talking to the colonists, the Americans here, you cannot settle west of this line, okay? This is Indian territory. We don't want to deal with more fighting and more war. That is what the British government is thinking. The colonists here, well, these people came to America for a reason. They want to settle more and more territory. And so they want to keep pushing westwards. They see no legitimacy in this order. They think this is ridiculous. This is our territory. We're going to keep pushing west. Of course, they do not hold the Native Americans in very high regard. These colonists believe they should be the ones taking this territory. And so, let me ask you a question. Do you think they obey this proclamation? Of course they don't. They continue to settle west of this proclamation line, and they're very upset at the government for even setting this up.
For colonial land speculators, pioneers, and farmers, the proclamation cuts off access to a vast source of cheap land.
Right, and speculators are a big one there. Remember, there's always money tied up in everything. These land speculators are making an incredible amount of money, right? They are essentially betting on these tracts of land, and then when they can finally secure them, they're making a lot of money on this territory. Because, it's either being taken by force from the indigenous people, or there are some land deals made, but of course the Native Americans are not getting good deals on this land, right? And so these speculators are making a lot of money. So you have the sort of pioneers on the ground who have this interest in moving west, and of course these speculators who are making the big bucks, right? And now their source of income's being cut off. They don't like that.
And stokes further anti-parliamentary feeling.
And by the way, this is in many ways the root of dynamic we still have today, which is sort of the government elite out east. Now, initially out east literally meant all the way in Britain across the Atlantic. Now out east means the East Coast, or your coastal elites, versus those out west, right? Those on the frontier. There's always been this dynamic between those who want to push west and want to settle and see themselves as these rugged individualists versus the elites who are actually running the government. There's always been this tension between these two forces. Now, at the moment, it's a tension between these people settling out west, these frontiersmen, and often British colonial administrators, whether in the Americas or in Britain. That tension will evolve into these frontiersmen versus American federal officials, but some of that dynamic is already here at this point.
Colony's list of grievances seems to grow year by year. And with each new attempt by the British Parliament to assert its authority, colonial resistance grows fiercer and bolder. The destruction of 46 tons of East India Company tea in the so-called Boston Tea Party is the final straw.
Yep.
Lord North's government decides to make an example of Boston.
Because once again, let's think about, it's always about money, right? And so, there's been literal violence against British tax collectors. But what gets the Parliament really going? The destruction of property. This is losing, the British government essentially, through their corporation, a lot of money. They cannot stand that. They cannot abide that. And so now they're going to take action.
And the colony of Massachusetts. In the spring of 1774, the British send 4,000 troops to occupy the colony and pass a series of measures known as the Coercive Acts. The governor is replaced by a new military governor, General Gage. Boston's port is closed to commerce by Royal Navy blockade. Representative assemblies in Massachusetts are limited, and it becomes easier for British troops to requisition housing throughout the colonies.
Right, and this is why we have our Third Amendment. But you can see here, things have really escalated at this point, right? Now, we started off with these taxes, which, may appear sort of somewhat limited compared to this, which is this immediate tyrannical direct control over Boston, right? You see all these actions. Now, if people were already feeling like the British government was behaving in a tyrannical and non-representative manner against them, well, they've sort of been justified in thinking that due to all these actions that are being taken. Now their rights and their liberties, as Englishmen, right? Because these people still see themselves as these, English subjects. They feel they have rights and liberties in this English tradition. Well, now those rights and liberties have absolutely been violated in a very direct manner.
The British government also passes the Quebec Act. To appease French Canadians, Catholicism is to be tolerated in Canada, angering staunch New England Protestants.
Yeah, at this point, New England has already come a long way from the early, intense Puritan roots, but it's still a very Protestant region of North America. This, they don't like this. They don't like this at all.
Large tracts of Midwestern land are also allocated to the province of Quebec, further antagonizing American colonists who had their eyes on the land. In America, the Coercive Acts are quickly labeled the Intolerable Acts.
Yep.
And the effect is the opposite of that intended. The colonies rally in support of Massachusetts and in defiance of the latest act of parliamentary tyranny.
I love that this was referenced last time as well. I don't think I mentioned it last time. It's a political cartoon by the one and only Benjamin Franklin, which was actually from a couple of years prior to this. But as you can imagine, this imagery was very much reused during the Revolution and has become very iconic and very associated with this revolutionary moment. The chopped up snake. The idea that, well, all these colonies, we must join or die, right? We all gotta come together or, well, it's gonna be done for us. Like I said, this was not made for this moment. It was made a couple years before, but you can see how it's applicable to this moment, or becoming applicable as tensions ramp up.
In Virginia, the House of Burgesses declares its support for Massachusetts, and is promptly shut down by the royal governor, Lord Dunmore. So Virginians reconvene in their own assemblies, and once more call for their rights under the British Constitution to be upheld. One of the most radical statements comes from Fairfax County, where the meeting is chaired by local patriot landowner George Washington.
This is when you really start seeing a lot of these characters pop up. George Washington, we already saw mentioned in reference to the 7 Years' War. See a lot of these guys. A still pretty young Thomas Jefferson, who's really getting his feet wet in politics. So some big names will begin to pop up.
10 years earlier, the colonies had not dared to claim that only they had the right to govern themselves. Now, they don't hold back.
Resolved, as the inhabitants of the American colonies are not, and from their situation cannot, be represented in the British Parliament, the legislative power here can of right be exercised only by our own provincial assemblies.
So you can see how this is an escalation, right? Because the initial issue is no taxation without representation. As in, you're imposing these taxes on us, these policies, and yet we're not represented in the parliament, and we should be. Well, we've evolved from that to now where, it still is not calling for independence, but what it's saying is, in order for us to be represented, we can only be represented through our own assemblies. That is the only legitimate version of this British legislative authority in the American colonies, right? And so you're seeing a further separation, and they're calling essentially for more and more autonomy. Now, of course, everyone already was sort of on board with the idea of the colonial assemblies running things, but now they're directly stating, hey, these assemblies, they're the only legitimate legislative authority that we recognize. So things are getting more and more tense. There's a further separation from Britain and the British Parliament. Once again, it's still not independence, but you can see how we're moving closer and closer to that point.
Resolved, the powers over the people of America, now claimed by the British House of Commons, must, if continued, establish the most grievous and intolerable species of tyranny and oppression that ever was inflicted upon mankind.
Maybe a little over-exaggerated, but, they're mad.
Virginian patriots call for a Congress composed of delegates from the colonies to meet and discuss a collective response to the latest crisis.
Oh.
Such calls are echoed across the colonies, and in September 1774, the First Continental Congress meets in Carpenter's Hall, Philadelphia.
And I think I made a point of this last time, but this is when we truly start to see the formation of an America. You know what I mean? I don't mean America as the sort of geographical term, but meaning the country that will become the United States of America, right? We've got these 13 separate colonies, which in some ways have their own interests and did not need to come together, right? I mean, Virginia in some ways is similar to Massachusetts, but in some ways is quite different, right? They did not have to recognize each other as in the same situation and come together. They could have been like, meh, you can handle your own thing. We're not going to get involved. It looks like a lot more trouble than it's worth. But that's not what happens. Through actions, and this is a big one, like calling the First Continental Congress, we see these colonies begin to come together and start to recognize they're part of this shared struggle. And some people had already been pushing for this idea of a shared struggle across the colonies. I always talk about the formation of a unified American identity. Because, of course, up until this point, sure, you'll see references to Americans in literature, but it was not referring to any sort of nationality. It's more sort of a geographical term, right? These people identified themselves as British subjects. They may have identified with a particular religion, whatever. But now what we see is the beginning of this process of the formation of some type of American identity. What does it mean to be an American? Do we all have a shared struggle? Well, yes, we do. I was talking about Benjamin Franklin, who was someone who really sort of pushes this early idea of an American identity through his newspapers and through the postal system, right? People like that are starting to bring everybody together. It's not just that we're operating as 13 separate colonies, but maybe we're all one big thing, right? Maybe one big country, perhaps.
It is attended by 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. Among them, several men who will play key roles in the struggle ahead.
Oh, yeah.
John and Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, self-made men incensed by the British occupation of their colony.
And, Massachusetts, those guys in particular were real rabble-rousers. You can really, in some ways, see the quality of each colony here, or each state as they will become, by who they send, right? Massachusetts is represented by these guys who very much represent this class of middling to upper class, in many ways self-made sort of businessmen and merchantmen, right? That's exactly the type we're talking about here, who tended to be pretty radical, well-read, very much inspired by this type of radical patriot rhetoric. You can look at other states, like Virginia, who is going to send primarily their sort of class of planter elites, right? So you can see, in some ways, And of course, there's a discrepancy here where, most Virginians were not planter elites, but that's who sort of ran the colony. So what you're seeing here is really the leadership class of each colony represented, and that leadership class may have made up more or less of the population of each colony, right? I mean, things operated differently in these different colonies.
John Dickinson, a moderate from Pennsylvania who seeks reconciliation with Britain.
Yep.
And Patrick Henry, the radical from Virginia, who holds what for most is still an extreme position: total independence.
Yeah, and I say that, the New Englanders tended to be more radical, but Patrick Henry here is breaking the mold. He is one of, if not the most radical of the bunch, in terms of the patriot cause, and he's a Virginian.
From Great Britain.
He's representing Virginia.
Despite their divisions, a compromise is reached. The colonies agree to boycott all British goods until the intolerable acts are repealed. They will also send another petition to King George III, listing their grievances, while expressing continued loyalty and desire for reconciliation.
Yeah, so that's still the point we're at, right? Maybe the rare independent supporter, we're still a long way from that. Well, actually, we're not that far away. But in terms of rhetoric, the idea still is, yeah, we're really mad, and we're going to boycott and resist and whatever, but we still proclaim loyalty to the British Crown, as we should, as good subjects, and we still want reconciliation. That is still the line. And this is where you can talk a little bit about the policy of the British government, the Crown and the Parliament, where they're not really handling any of this very well, right? They sort of keep pushing when they shouldn't. They pull back when it weakens them, right? They're not handling this very well, but overall, they do stand behind their sort of principle that they have a right to unilaterally tax the colonies. And this puts them at an impasse. And I think perhaps if the government or the king had been a little more willing to compromise, you might have ended up with a different situation. But, as with many revolutions, that was not the case. The power, in this case Parliament and the king, well, they were in the end going to be pretty stubborn. You can see a somewhat similar situation with the English Civil War. The king, he just refused to compromise in the end. It was never enough, and so, well, you're going to see an outbreak of violence and revolution.
We ask but for peace, liberty, and safety. Your royal authority over us and our connection with Great Britain, we shall always carefully and zealously endeavor to support and maintain.
Their petition never receives a formal response.
And of course, you can think about the king's perspective here, or Parliament, and of course, I think I said this before, but Parliament was not necessarily unified on this. You had members of Parliament who were sympathetic or even supportive of the American cause. But when I talk about Parliament as an institution, it does support its own claim to tax and rule over the colonies. So that's what I mean when I say Parliament, though it was not unified. But, no official response. You can see from the king and Parliament's perspective that they're thinking, this is ridiculous. These are our colonies. We can do whatever the hell we want to them. If we want to tax them, we can tax them. If we want to impose whatever policies we want, we can do that. They have no right to stand up against us. Which, in some ways, I think is a violation of that English principle of liberty and freedom laid out by John Locke, for example. And a lot of these American revolutionaries are very much inspired by the writing of John Locke. So there's you could really make the argument on either end here. But for the king, he's thinking, I can't believe this. They're reaching out to me for reconciliation. No, they should just give up. Okay? I have a right to do everything that I'm doing. There's no way they're coming at me like this. And, well, that's sort of the line of thought they're going to continue on.
The First Continental Congress cannot solve the crisis, but it has demonstrated that the colonies can come together to debate shared grievances and form a plan of action.
Very important.
The delegates are impressed with their fellow Americans and recognize the importance of their task.
There's the snake again.
A new sense of solidarity inspires confidence that, if required, they can work together again for the common interest of all.
The disease was believed to have been confined to the town of Boston, but now it's so universal, there's no knowing where to apply a remedy. From Gage.
In America, the long history of colonial and frontier wars means most British colonies maintain their own militia. Now, these part-time citizen soldiers are training regularly under local officers, anticipating a confrontation with the British.
Yeah, this was a pretty well-armed population, you know? I mean, there's a lot to be said about sort of American gun culture, the connections from then to today, which I don't think are always appropriate or accurate, but it is true, this is a pretty well-armed population, and at least a good chunk of the population is either experienced in warfare, usually frontier warfare, or they're doing this sort of militia training, right? And that's becoming more and more common as tensions heat up. All these colonials coming together to do this militia training. Now, don't get me wrong, they're not very well equipped. Most of them are still not very well trained. I mean, they're nothing compared to the British regular army, but some of them have some experience. They have some weapons at least, even if it's your, grandpa's hunting rifle. So there's some ability to resist, even if you would never think about standing up to the British Army, one of the greatest military forces in the world at this point.
It's a growing concern for General Thomas Gage, the British commander in North America, with 4,000 troops in Boston. He's also worried about the gunpowder reserves, held at strategic locations across Massachusetts, for use by government and militia forces. With tensions running high, control of the gunpowder becomes a priority for both sides.
Yeah.
In September 1774, Gage sends 260 men to secure a powder magazine in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. In such a suspicious atmosphere, the sight of British redcoats on the march ignites wild rumours that villages are being attacked, civilians massacred, and that British warships are shelling Boston.
Yeah, this really puts everyone on high alert. I mean, we've seen how high the tension is, right? I mean, at this point, it's already been years since the Boston Massacre. Violence has continued. People are really tense. They are worried that a fight's going to start, and frankly, they're expecting one at this point. So seeing the British regulars, the Red Coats, famously, marching through the countryside, everyone's like, uh-oh, is it kicking off?
None of them are true. Nevertheless, thousands of angry patriots gather in the streets of Cambridge, prompting local loyalists to flee to Boston. The patriots disperse the next day, but both sides are rattled by the incident.
I mean, this is really classic revolutionary fervor and fear, right? You can think of, say, the French Revolution, where there are several points during the Revolution where the crowds really work themselves up into a frenzy, into a violent riot over fears that the king is going to march into the city, take control, use his troops to kill them or shell the city, right? In an atmosphere like this, and we're really at that peak point of tension, these rumors that are going around, they can lead to these explosions of unrest and violence and riots and mob justice and all this sorts of stuff.
That winter, General Gage pulls his forces back within Boston and begins to fortify approaches to the city. He also requests reinforcements from Britain. Parliament delays, The British Army is tiny, and sending troops to America is expensive. But with each passing month, colonial opposition grows stronger and more impassioned. In February, Parliament declares parts of the colony of Massachusetts to be in active rebellion.
Oh.
On the 23rd of March 1775, Patrick Henry addresses the Virginia Convention.
If we were base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat, sir, let it come. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.
Yeah. Can't help myself. No, but I mean, look, Patrick Henry here, as we know, he's sort of been wanting this for a while. You know what I mean? Let it come, he says. He's been wanting independence. He's been wanting this fight. And so, now that it's happening, he's like, hey, everybody, it's happening. It's time. Now's the time to stand up and fight, to be in solidarity with our comrades up in Boston, right? And of course, a very famous speech there from Patrick Henry.
The following month, General Gage receives orders to disarm the local militia and arrest its leaders. He targets a small town 20 miles from Boston called Concord, where he believes Patriot munitions and stores are stockpiled. But the Patriot militia know the British are coming, and the long-simmering standoff between Britain and its colonies is about to explode into open warfare.
We're getting some real iconic moments here. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Well, prophetic words.
19th of April, 1775, Boston. Around midnight, 700 British infantry, drawn from elite grenadier and light infantry companies, cross Boston Harbor in boats and begin their march to Concord. They are led by 51-year-old Colonel Francis Smith, who's been stationed in America for 8 years. His operation is supposed to be secret. The route has been carefully planned, and British scouts and spies patrol the countryside. But the Patriots have their own spy network in Boston. And before the British have even left the city, several Patriot horsemen, including Paul Revere, have ridden out to raise the alarm across eastern Massachusetts.
Hey, this is when those Minutemen come in handy, right? The idea is, in exactly a situation like this, we can ride through the countryside, let you know the British are coming, and these Minutemen, well, they're ready to pick up their arms, get out there, you know, try to form, and be ready to fight, right? I mean, shows you, by the way, how tense the situation was. I mean, the colony's been declared in open rebellion. Everyone knows a fight is coming. They may not have predicted it would be like this, but everyone is sort of ready for violence to kick off.
In Lexington, Militia Captain John Parker is alerted to the approaching British column. He gathers 80 militiamen on the village green to observe their advance. Around dawn, at 5 a.m., the head of the British column arrives. Redcoat officers order the militiamen to lay down their arms. Shouts and jeers are traded. Then a shot rings out. From which side is not clear.
We don't know.
The British regulars fire a flurry of shots. The militia run for cover. 8 lie dead or dying. Just 1 British soldier is wounded. This small skirmish, lasting just a few minutes, is the first clash of the American Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I mean, this is the shot heard around the world. This is where it starts. No one knows who fired first, as it often is in these types of situations. It's not like it's a big, drag-out battle. Just these American militiamen line up, fire at each other. You know, mostly they get injured, killed. They flee the battlefield. But now it's started, right? This is an open skirmish. This is the beginning of a war. That's what this is, right? We had of course, Boston Massacre, but this is different, right? I mean, like I said, this is a war at this point, and that's what it's going to erupt into. It's begun, really.
The British march on to Concord. But the element of surprise they'd been counting on was lost hours ago.
Yeah.
On arrival, the British discover most of the Patriot stores have been hidden or removed. They spread out across town to destroy what they can find. Meanwhile, a large militia force gathers to the north, on a hill overlooking the town. They include several companies of the famous Minutemen, picked men from local settlements, ready to march at a minute's notice.
Exactly.
400 strong, they outnumber the British detachment guarding North Bridge 4-1. The militia are agitated. There are rumors of a massacre at Lexington. They can see smoke rising from Concord. Under pressure from his men to act, Militia Colonel James Barrett orders an advance to the bridge.
Yeah, they want to fight. And one thing we're seeing here is that, now, of course, Britain has the advantage in terms of resources, manpower, really everything. However, one thing is that the British are gonna, as this is kicking off and as the war really gets into swing, the British will have to treat the colonies now as hostile enemy territory, which means they're gonna need to cover the territory and hold it if they want to win this conflict, whereas the Patriots don't necessarily have to do that, right? They can jab at the British in these specific places. They don't need to blanket the countryside and hold it. Now, to be clear, there were plenty of loyalists in the American colonies. It's not like the Patriots had 100% support, or maybe at times even a majority support among the population. The numbers you often see is it's like a third were Patriots, a third neutral, a third loyalists. But the truth is that for the Patriots, this is home territory, whereas for these British regulars, it's enemy territory. We see a little bit of that here, and we'll kind of see this throughout the conflict and what we're going to see probably through the rest of this video. Although I want us to start thinking, as we follow this war, as it really kicks into gear, the question is sort of, how will the American revolutionaries, the Patriots, how will they win this conflict, even though they're going to be losing a lot of the battles we're going to see? A lot of the battles between the Patriots and the British will end in a loss for the Patriots, and yet in the end, they still win this war. So that's something to keep in mind as we witness these battles and the conflict play out.
Both sides have orders not to fire first. But alarmed by the approaching militia, the British fire a ragged volley.
Uh-oh.
The militia return fire. A handful of men fall killed and wounded on each side.
Now it's a real battle.
The outnumbered redcoats turn and run. The militia, stunned by their own success, do not pursue.
They're like, wait, what the hell? Did we
A
win?
standoff resumes, but now with bodies from both sides strewn across the battleground. The British commander, Colonel Smith, recognizes how exposed his force is.
Yeah.
And around noon, he orders his men to march back to Boston.
I mean, this is not going how he wanted it to go. The idea was that they would quietly and sneakily sort of make their way out to Concord, destroy these storage of gunpowder and guns, or requisition them, right, and take it back to Boston. That was sort of the idea, or Cambridge, right? Now, from the beginning, the operation was leaked. Everyone knew about it. They ran into some resistance at Lexington. Now, it didn't slow them down very much, but what it did was it alerted everybody in the area. Now they ran into some serious resistance in Concord. This operation is not going as planned. Time to wrap it up. However, and he's right that they're exposed. Now they have to make their way all the way back through the countryside. And that is not going to be without issues.
By this time, thousands of Patriot militia are lining the road. They mount a series of ambushes on the British, targeting officers, several of whom are killed and wounded.
Yeah.
The British respond by bursting into homes along the route to clear out rebel marksmen, bayoneting anyone they find within.
So, I mean, very brutal combat. We see the beginning of sort of mistreatment of people who may not be involved, but also a lot of this is not regular combat, right? You know, it's not, I mean, sure, we saw in Lexington and Concord sort of a traditional line up and shoot each other, but what we're seeing now is these militiamen are forming in each of their local little towns or hamlets. They're coming up to the road or the British retreat, and they're sort of ambushing them, you know? Well, you know, this is not, like I said, traditional regular combat. It's closer to a sort of, in some ways, a guerrilla style of combat, though it's not, you know, don't over-exaggerate that. And we'll sort of see that character of warfare throughout this conflict. You will have a lot of these more regular, normal-style battles, but we will also see some more, you might call them guerrilla, or maybe frontier-style tactics, might be a more appropriate way to put it.
The British march descends into a shambolic retreat. Around 2 p.m., Smith's force reaches Lexington. Here, they are met by reinforcements from Boston, Lord Percy's brigade, 1,000 strong, with 2 cannon.
And they brought the guns.
They face nearly 4,000 Patriot militia. Percy's 2 guns open fire, dispersing the militia and buying the British some time before the retreat continues. Lord Percy oversees a more disciplined fighting retreat, but militia sniping claims a steady toll of his men.
Yeah. I mean, even if you're not getting into these sort of one-on-one confrontations, you've got Patriots the whole way down taking pot shots at troops and officers and killing some of them, right? So if you're the British, this is not going well for you.
As the embattled Redcoats approach Boston, they veer east to avoid another large militia force gathering at Cambridge. They reach the safety of Charlestown around nightfall. Many British soldiers have been marching and fighting without rest for almost 24 hours. All told, the British have lost 73 men killed and 173 wounded. The Americans, 49 killed and 39 wounded. It was nearly much worse for the British. As Lord Percy later writes of his rescue of Smith's force,
I had the happiness of saving them from inevitable destruction.
Yeah.
of their opponents, he adds,
Whoever dares to look upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. They have men amongst them who know very well what they are about.
Oh yeah, quite the insight there. So look, once again, these Patriots, the Americans, they've got less training, less supplies, all that sort of stuff. But as we mentioned earlier, you know, they've been doing this militia training. Some of them had military experience, especially frontier experience. And so, among this group, yeah, there are many who have very little to no experience. The supplies aren't great. The guns, a lot of them are pretty old. But a fair number of these guys have some experience. They know what they're doing. And though this is not necessarily a regular fighting force, it's definitely not an irregular mob. Percy is exactly right here.
By the scale of 18th century warfare, the battles of Lexington and Concord are not much more than skirmishes. But the ramifications will be seismic.
Oh, yeah. I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust from Washington.
In the aftermath of the fighting, 15,000 militiamen encircle Boston. The British are under siege. Massachusetts is in open rebellion.
Yeah, now it really
The
is.
news spreads like a shockwave. 3 weeks later, a second Continental Congress gathers in Philadelphia.
Right, because now it's time. You know what I mean? Patrick Henry's been saying it's time to join our brothers in arms in Massachusetts. Well, now it's time. You know, like they said, these battles are skirmishes. You look at the numbers of dead and wounded, they're not massive, but these were real battles, right? The British Army has been directly challenged in the field, and of course, though it's not this massive battle, they were forced to draw back. This is it, right? The war has begun, so it's time for everybody to get together and work out what they're gonna do. And of course, many of them, and especially those like Patrick Henry, are like, here it is, it started, now we fight.
Delegates had expected to be busy coordinating further protests. But suddenly, with the colonies in open conflict with the British, they begin to take on the work of a wartime government. Congress appoints a committee to secure military supplies, votes to raise loans to pay for them, and issue bills of credit. It also passes resolutions to reach out to potential allies in Canada, Britain's Caribbean colonies, and among Native American tribes. Many delegates are veterans of the first Congress, but there are also new faces.
Some very important new faces.
The celebrated inventor Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, who has returned from England. He is appointed Postmaster General with orders to establish a new postal service.
And Benjamin Franklin, he's a real important guy. You know what I mean? He's not, when we talk about the actual war effort, the fighting of the war, he's not the most involved with that. But Benjamin Franklin, this postal service, actually be pretty important. You might be surprised to hear that, but this is really one of the things that holds these colonies together. This will be extremely important. Plus, Benjamin Franklin will be very important in negotiations and diplomacy with outside powers, France in particular, and also Britain by the end of the war. Not to mention, Benjamin Franklin plays a big role in, as I've said before, crafting this idea of being an American. And Benjamin Franklin, at this point, around the world, is the most famous American, bar none. He's a famous thinker, inventor particularly. You know, he's been around Europe. He's very well known, right? So he really uses his reputation here in order to advocate for the patriot cause.
Then there's the wealthy merchant John Hancock of Massachusetts. And in June, they are joined by the young lawyer Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. But Congress's most urgent priority is to form a united Continental Army that can stand against the inevitable British response. It is obvious that the large militia forces around Boston will be the Army's foundation. But who will lead them? For many in Congress, there's only one man for the job. The 43-year-old Virginian delegate, George Washington. He is well known for his patriot views and admired for his military service in the French and Indian War. As a not-so-subtle reminder of his credentials, the 6'2" Washington attends Congress in his Fairfax militia officer's uniform.
Right, so, first of all, 6'2", this man was a giant for that era. You can read sort of descriptions of George Washington. He was a giant, he was very strong. People were often amazed by his feats of strength. I think this is part of, and we'll be talking about Washington during this series. He had quite the force of personality. He was actually, I guess, more understated, but he had a real charisma to him, a real aura, as you might say, really quite inspiring to those around him. I think definitely a part of that, along with his understated style and sort of calm charisma and leadership, was just how tall he was, how much of a physical specimen he was. But I like to point to this moment where Washington is often seen as someone who, didn't like the spotlight and wasn't ambitious and all that sort of stuff. And there are times when that is true. This is not one of those times. Washington, wearing his uniform here, he's really telling everybody, though he won't necessarily say it, hey, I want the job, right? This is a moment when he is being ambitious. Now, to be fair, when Washington is president later in his life, I do believe he genuinely is not that interested, and people really have to force him into the office. He'd rather just go home. But sometimes the sort of reputation of George Washington as this humble, not ambitious individual, man, could sort of obscure the truth, which in this case is he's being ambitious, he wants the job. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying, don't let the reputation and the rhetoric obscure the reality here.
John Adams, who nominates him for command, also believes appointing a Virginian to command New England troops will bolster the colony's unity.
Right. And there's always an eye towards this. Really, throughout American history, especially early American history, but even at this point, and especially at this point when things are still so shaky, yes, these colonies have been coming together, and they're forming some sort of unified something, but it could really fall apart at any moment. And so, people who are thinking about this, like Adams, have an eye towards, we gotta keep everyone unified. There are pretty significant divisions between these different colonies. You've got your southern colonies, your middle colonies, and your northern colonies. And especially the north and the south, they've got a lot of differences. Slavery is the one that most people will think of, though slavery was pretty common in a lot of the colonies, even in the middle colonies and northern colonies. But even beyond that, there's a lot of differences in religion and way of life and all this sort of stuff. And so there's an eye towards, all right, we got to keep everyone together, so let's appoint a Virginian, right? It's good for unity. We don't want sectarianism between the different colonies. We got to make sure everyone can stick together because that's the only way we're going to make it out of this. It's really join or die, that Franklin political cartoon.
On the 15th of June, 1775, Congress unanimously approves Washington's appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He agrees to serve without pay, only expenses. Yet he, like many Americans, is dismayed by the prospect of war.
Unhappy it is that the once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or inhabited by a race of slaves. Sad alternatives. But can a virtuous man hesitate in his choice?
In the tumultuous years ahead, many delegates will question the decision to give Washington command.
Yeah, we think of George Washington today, and especially in America, there's such a sort of reputation, right? We couldn't possibly imagine that he may have had detractors, but he did. During his service, he'll be challenged many times. He'll have a lot of criticism levied against him. People will say he's not cut out for the job. Now, I think he absolutely proves that he is cut out for the job. Is he the greatest general of all time? No. But he does his job, and he's a damn good leader, an inspiring, charismatic leader, right? So I think he absolutely does prove himself up for the task, but he gets a lot of criticism, and there's a lot of detractors at that time. I did also want to point out, and we've seen this a few times in this video, you see a lot of the language, and I think I mentioned this last time, maybe not. There's a lot of the language of slavery in the rhetoric here about how we won't be made slaves to Great Britain and how we'll resist slavery and tyranny. Obviously, there's the blatant hypocrisy here of a lot of these guys, including Washington, of course, own slaves or are supportive of slavery, and yet they use all this rhetoric, right? So there's that hypocrisy right there at the root of it all. There's the occasional founding father who was opposed to slavery, but a lot of them were not, and a lot of them owned slaves, and yet still use this rhetoric. So just something to point out.
But ultimately, it will prove one of the best decisions ever made by Congress.
True.
The challenge Washington faces is immense. To form a professional army from scratch, with half-trained contingents from disparate colonies, to take on one of the world's most successful military powers. And before Washington can even reach the army, he learns the British have already attacked.
Uh-oh.
If you want to be first to see new episodes of the American Revolution, then prestige streaming service Nebula is the place to be. Right now on Nebula, you can also watch the first 2 episodes of another new series.
There we go. I want to get their ad in since this is a new one. You can go and check out their video. I will link it down below. Go give them a like, subscribe. Go check out their sponsor, right? We want to show Epic History support for making these fantastic videos that we all enjoy. So please go and check out their video. Go and watch it on your own terms. These reactions are additive. Right? They're meant to be adding to the content. So please go and show them some support. Yeah, Washington. Who else would you have chosen for the job? Really? Like I said, Washington, in terms of sort of battlefield acumen, I don't think anyone would argue. Most people who know anything about him wouldn't argue he's the greatest general of all time, but I think he's truly an incredible leader. Probably one of the best leaders, I don't know, I mean, definitely this country's ever seen, right? And that goes beyond just battlefield acumen, right? That goes into his political leadership, his leadership over his army outside the field of battle, all this sort of stuff. And I don't really think there was anyone else who could have done the job apart from George Washington. And he does it. And we'll see that throughout these episodes. So yeah, another episode of Epic History series on the American Revolution. I've certainly been enjoying this one. If you guys have as well, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. It'll give you access to exclusive reaction videos. Now, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.